The military K-9 stopped in the middle of the hospital hallway, ignored every command from his handler, and walked straight to the new nurse. Nobody knew anything about her past. What happened next would reveal a secret she had hidden for years, and leave an entire hospital questioning everything they thought they knew about her. Monday mornings at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center were never truly quiet. Long before sunrise painted the Washington skyline in shades of gold, the hospital was already alive with the familiar rhythm of organized urgency. Nurses moved swiftly through polished corridors, physicians reviewed patient charts, wheelchairs rolled softly across spotless floors. The comforting aroma of fresh coffee drifted from the staff lounge. It was a place where remarkable people worked every day. But even among remarkable people, there was always someone new. That morning, it was Sydney Brant. At 33, Sydney looked nothing like the image many people imagined when they thought of a trauma nurse. She wasn't loud. She didn't command attention. She didn't walk through the hallways expecting anyone to notice her. Instead, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Chestnut brown hair neatly tied into a low ponytail, sky blue scrubs pressed without a wrinkle, her white ID badge reading simply, Sydney Brant, RN. No impressive titles, no military ribbons, no lengthy credentials, just 3 letters. To most people, she looked like someone starting a brand new chapter, and that was exactly how she wanted it. "Morning!" Nurse Paige Delgado smiled as Sydney entered the emergency department. "You must be the new trauma nurse." "I am." Sydney shook her hand. "Paige Delgado. Don't worry, the first week here feels like drinking from a fire hose." Sydney laughed softly. "I've heard. If you survive Monday," Paige grinned, "you'll survive anything." Within minutes, she was introduced to physicians, respiratory therapists, radiology technicians, and fellow nurses. Everyone welcomed her warmly, but one question surfaced again and again. "So," Dr. Ronan Keyes asked while organizing patient files, "where did you work before this?" "A military hospital," Sydney answered without hesitation. "Oh? Mostly trauma. Which one?" She paused for only the briefest moment. "Several." Then she redirected the conversation. "Where do you keep your emergency ultrasound supplies?" It was subtle enough that no one thought much of it, except Paige. Later that morning, she leaned toward another nurse. "Did you notice?" "Notice what?" "She never actually answers personal questions." The other nurse shrugged. "Some people are private." Paige smiled. "She's interesting." Over the next few days, Sydney quickly earned everyone's respect. She remembered every patient's name. She noticed details others overlooked. She could calm anxious families with only a few gentle words. She stayed late without being asked, and she never complained. Still, something about her remained a mystery. No photographs decorated her locker, no stories about college, no conversations about family vacations, no social media discussions during lunch breaks. Whenever coworkers talked about their lives, Sydney listened with genuine interest, but she rarely spoke about her own. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't secrecy born from distrust, it was simply silence. Hospital Director Harold Pemberton noticed her during her second week. He stood quietly outside Trauma Room 3, watching Sydney comfort an elderly veteran awaiting test results. She didn't rush, she didn't speak in rehearsed phrases. She simply pulled up a chair, sat beside him, and listened. When the conversation ended, the veteran smiled with tears in his eyes. Pemberton turned to the charge nurse. "How long has Brant been here?" "Less than 2 weeks." He looked surprised. "Feels longer. Patients already ask for her." "Some nurses have good hands," the charge nurse smiled, "and some have good hearts. I think she has both." Friday morning began unusually calm. No major emergencies, no trauma alerts, no helicopter landings. Around 10 o'clock, Paige walked into the nurses' station, carrying a clipboard. "Sydney? We've got a routine appointment coming in." "What kind?" Paige smiled. "You'll like this one. A retired military working dog. Apparently he comes every few months for routine wellness exams. Physical checkup, joint evaluation, nothing serious." Sydney nodded almost imperceptibly. "What breed?" "German Shepherd." She lowered her eyes to the chart. Name? Paige checked the paperwork. Duke. For the first time since arriving at Walter Reed, something changed in Sydney's expression. Not fear, not excitement, recognition. A feeling so fleeting anyone who blinked would have missed it. She quietly reached for the chart, fingers stopping halfway, then let Paige keep holding it. I'll prepare exam room 4, Sydney said. You okay? Of course. You looked like you'd heard the name before. Sydney smiled gently. Military dogs have memorable names. Paige chuckled. Fair enough. But Sydney's heartbeat had already begun to quicken. Not because she recognized the name, but because somewhere deep inside, she'd hoped she wouldn't. At precisely 10:17 a.m., the automatic hospital doors slid open. Conversation slowed, not because something was wrong, but because people naturally noticed whenever a military working dog entered the building. Walking proudly beside his handler was a magnificent black and tan German shepherd, with a slightly graying muzzle and calm amber-brown eyes. His black tactical service harness carried several worn patches from years of faithful service. Although retired, he still carried himself with unmistakable discipline, every step measured, every movement deliberate. Patients smiled, children pointed excitedly, veterans instinctively straightened in their chairs. Someone whispered, "Beautiful dog." "This is Duke," the handler said, smiling politely. Paige whispered to Sydney, "He's gorgeous." Sydney looked toward the hallway. For a brief moment, neither she nor Duke moved. The handler signed paperwork at reception. Duke stood patiently at his left side, calm, focused, professional, exactly as a military working dog should be. Then Duke slowly lifted his head. His ears stood alert. His eyes searched the emergency department until they found Sydney. Everything about him changed. His tail didn't wag, he didn't bark, he didn't growl. Instead, he became perfectly still, the kind of stillness handlers recognized immediately. He had seen someone. Duke, the handler noticed. No response. Duke, heel. The German shepherd didn't move. His gaze never left the quiet nurse standing across the hallway. Doctors looked up from their charts. Patients noticed the sudden silence. Paige frowned. What's he doing? The handler gave another calm command. Duke, heel. Still nothing. The dog took one slow step forward, then another. The leash remained loose. Duke. This time the handler's voice carried gentle concern. The retired military K9 had never ignored him before. Not once. Across the hallway, Sydney stood motionless. Her breathing slowed. Her hands remained relaxed at her sides. She said nothing. She simply watched him, as if she already knew what everyone else was about to witness. The hallway became so quiet that even the distant beeping of heart monitors seemed louder than before. Nearly everyone who happened to be walking through the emergency department had stopped. Doctors, nurses, patients, veterans waiting for appointments, even a young boy who looked up from the coloring book in his lap. All eyes were on Duke. The retired military working dog stood motionless, amber-brown eyes fixed on one person. His handler gave another calm command. Duke, heel. Nothing. The German shepherd remained perfectly still, not frightened, not aggressive, simply looking at Sydney with an intensity that seemed almost impossible to explain. The handler frowned. That's strange. Paige glanced at Sydney. Do you know this dog? Sydney hesitated only a second. I don't think so. Her answer sounded sincere. Yet something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely certain herself. The handler gently shortened the leash. Come on, partner. For the first time in nearly 9 years together, Duke refused. Gasps spread quietly through the waiting area. He ignored me. I've never seen that. Is something wrong? The handler knelt beside Duke. Easy, boy. He checked the dog's harness, his paws, his breathing. Everything appeared normal. No signs of illness, no injury, no distress. Duke simply continued watching Sydney. Then, without pulling, without lunging, without a single bark, he calmly began walking toward her. The leash slipped gently through the handler's fingers. Duke, the dog didn't hurry. Every step was slow, purposeful, measured. Exactly the way he had once approached military personnel during formal inspections. His nails clicked softly across the polished hospital floor, Click, click, click. The sound echoed through the hallway. Nobody moved. Paige whispered, "Should we stop him?" The handler shook his head. No. His voice was filled with confusion. "I've never seen him behave like this." Duke stopped 3 feet in front of Sydney. The two simply looked at one another. Seconds passed. No one spoke. Then something remarkable happened. The large German shepherd slowly lowered himself into a perfect sit, not casually, not comfortably, perfectly straight, front paws aligned, back rigid, head lifted, eyes forward. Anyone with military experience immediately recognized the posture. It wasn't a pet waiting for affection. It was a service dog reporting for duty. One elderly Marine veteran sitting nearby quietly removed his cap. He'd gone to attention. Sydney stared at Duke, her expression softening. For several long moments she said nothing. She didn't reach toward him, didn't pet him, didn't call his name. Instead, she slowly straightened her shoulders, almost unconsciously, as though responding to an old habit she'd forgotten she still possessed. Duke never looked away. The hallway remained silent. Paige finally whispered, "Sydney, are you okay?" She nodded without taking her eyes off the dog. "I'm fine." But her voice carried an emotion no one had heard from her before. Not fear, not surprise. Recognition, buried deep beneath years of silence. The handler stepped beside Duke. "I'm so sorry." He looked embarrassed. "He never does this." Sydney smiled gently. "It's all right. He usually follows commands immediately. I can tell." The handler laughed nervously. "Honestly, I don't know what's gotten into him." Duke continued sitting at attention, breathing calm, ears forward, his entire focus on Sydney, as though the rest of the hospital had disappeared. One of the orthopedic physicians walked closer. Maybe he recognizes her scent. Another nurse shrugged. "Impossible. They've never met." Paige looked toward Sydney again. "You've really never seen him before?" Sydney looked down at Duke. She stopped herself, then quietly answered, "I don't remember." The words sounded strange, not because they were dishonest, but because they seemed directed more toward herself than anyone else. The veterinarian assigned to Duke's appointment arrived carrying a tablet. "Everything all right?" The handler sighed. "Apparently not. He won't come." The veterinarian approached slowly. "Duke." The German shepherd didn't react. Another command followed. Nothing. The veterinarian smiled awkwardly. "Well, this is new." Laughter rippled softly through the waiting room. Not mocking, just nervous. No one understood what they were witnessing. Sydney slowly crouched until she was eye level with Duke, keeping her hands resting on her knees, never reaching for him. She knew better. Military working dogs respected calm, not excitement. Duke's eyes never left hers for several seconds. Neither moved. Finally, Sydney smiled. "So, you've gotten older." Paige blinked. "What?" The handler looked confused. "You sound like you've met him." Sydney immediately realized what she'd said. "I mean, I've known dogs like him." She stood again, trying to end the conversation. But Duke wasn't finished. He slowly lowered his head, then, with extraordinary gentleness, leaned forward, his nose lightly touching the edge of Sydney's right hand. Just once, barely enough for anyone to notice. It wasn't a greeting. It wasn't a request for affection. It was more deliberate than that, almost respectful. Sydney instinctively curled her fingers slightly. Duke closed his eyes for one brief moment. The handler's jaw dropped. "No." Paige looked between them. "What?" The handler spoke quietly. "He only does that when greeting someone he trusts completely." Every eye turned toward Sydney. Questions came immediately. "Where did you meet? Were you stationed together somewhere? Did you volunteer with military dogs? Were you his veterinarian?" Sydney smiled politely. "I'm sorry, I think you're giving me far too much credit." The veterinarian crossed his arms. "Duke has one of the best memories I've ever seen. If he's reacting like this, he knows you." Sydney looked away. Outside the large windows, sunlight reflected across the hospital courtyard. For the first time since joining Walter Reed, she wished she could simply disappear into the crowd. Director Harold Pemberton entered the hallway after hearing the commotion. "What seems to be happening?" Paige answered first. The retired military K9 refuses to leave our new nurse. Pemberton looked surprised. He walked toward Duke, who acknowledged him with a quick glance, then immediately returned his attention to Sydney. Well, Pemberton smiled. It looks like you've made a friend. The handler shook his head. Sir, respectfully, this isn't friendship. Everyone looked at him. His voice became quieter. I've handled Duke for almost 7 years. I've watched him greet generals. I've watched him greet admirals. I've watched him greet decorated veterans. I've watched him reunite with soldiers he saved overseas. He looked directly at Sydney. I've never seen him look at anyone like this. The hallway fell silent once again. Then something happened that no one expected. Duke slowly stood without waiting for permission. He walked around Sydney one careful step at a time, almost as though inspecting her, paused behind her, then beside her, and finally returned to stand directly in front of her once more. His tail remained still, his ears alert. Suddenly he lifted his right front paw, not to shake hands, not to beg, and placed it gently against Sydney's left shoe, then looked up into her eyes. The handler inhaled sharply. Oh my goodness. Paige whispered, what does that mean? The handler swallowed. It was something his first trainer taught him. When he found the person he was supposed to stay with, he'd place his paw on their boot and wait. Sydney's eyes widened ever so slightly. Before she could stop herself, she softly whispered 4 words. You still remember that? The moment the words left her lips, Duke's tail gave a single slow wag, the first one since entering the hospital. The handler stared at Sydney in complete disbelief, his voice barely above a whisper. You didn't just know him, you trained him. Sydney closed her eyes for a brief moment. The hallway waited. She slowly opened them again. No, she said quietly. I was never officially his trainer. She looked down at Duke, who still hadn't moved his paw. But I was there when he learned to trust people. And for the first time since arriving at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, the secret Sydney Brant had carried for years had begun to surface. The hallway remained silent. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. Duke still stood in front of Sydney, with one paw resting gently against her shoe, his amber eyes never leaving her face. The retired military canine wasn't demanding attention. He wasn't asking to be petted. He was waiting, exactly as he had been taught years before. Paige finally broke the silence. Sydney. Her voice was barely above a whisper. What does he mean by that? Sydney looked around the hallway. Doctors had stopped working. Patients had forgotten why they were waiting. Even Director Pemberton stood quietly with his arms folded, watching her with patient curiosity. For a long moment, Sydney simply smiled at Duke. Then she gently rested one hand on the side of his neck. The German shepherd closed his eyes. A quiet sigh escaped him, the first time anyone had touched him since he entered the hospital. The handler blinked. I haven't seen him relax in years. Sydney stroked the faded black harness. So, she whispered, you've still got the same stubborn heart. Duke's tail gave another slow wag. The handler stared. You know him. Sydney nodded softly. Yes. You really do. She looked at Duke again before answering. I knew him before he became the incredible service dog you see today. Questions immediately filled the hallway. You trained military dogs? Were you a K9 instructor? Were you his handler? Sydney shook her head. No, I wasn't his handler. She paused. And I was never his official trainer. The handler frowned. Then how does he know you? Sydney took a slow breath. I suppose the easiest way to explain it is to tell you who I used to be. The hallway became perfectly still once again. 10 years ago, she began quietly, I wasn't Nurse Sydney Brant. I was Chief Petty Officer Sydney Brant. Several veterans sitting nearby looked up immediately. I served as a Navy Special Operations combat medic attached to a SEAL team. Gasps spread through the room. Paige's eyes widened. You were attached to a SEAL team? Sydney nodded. For nearly 8 years. No one knew what to say. The quiet nurse who always volunteered for the hardest shifts, who stayed late without complaint, who rarely talked about herself, had spent years serving beside some of the military's most elite operators. Director Pemberton looked genuinely surprised. You never mentioned it. Sydney smiled gently. I came here to be a nurse, not to introduce myself by my past. She looked down at Duke again. My team occasionally worked with military working dogs before deployments. Not because I was their trainer, but because every operator understood something. She scratched gently behind his ear. The dogs weren't equipment. They were teammates. The handler slowly nodded. That's true. Sydney continued. After difficult missions, some dogs came back physically exhausted. She smiled. And some came back carrying things you couldn't see. The hallway understood exactly what she meant. There were times they didn't trust strangers, times they startled at sudden noises, times they simply needed someone willing to sit beside them without asking anything in return. Paige whispered. So that's where you met Duke? Sydney nodded. He was barely 2 years old. The story slowly unfolded. Duke had been young, brilliant, fearless, eager to work. But during one overseas deployment, the constant stress of combat environments had left him withdrawn around unfamiliar people. Not aggressive, not dangerous, simply cautious. Most trainers focused on obedience. Sydney focused on trust. I never tried to force him to like me, she smiled. I just sat beside him. Some days I read medical reports out loud. Some days I cleaned equipment. Sometimes I said nothing at all. Duke slowly rested his head against her shoulder, as though remembering every quiet afternoon. Sydney laughed softly. He always pretended he wasn't listening. The handler chuckled through moist eyes. He still does. Laughter spread gently through the hallway. The tension finally eased. Sydney continued. Eventually, one afternoon, I stood up to leave. She smiled at Duke, and he quietly followed me. I stopped walking. So did he. I turned. He sat down. I took another step. He followed again. The handler finished the story before she could. That was the trust exercise. Sydney looked surprised. You know it? He smiled. Every handler after me was taught about it. It's called... He looked toward Duke. Choose your person. Paige blinked. Choose your person? The handler nodded. When a military working dog voluntarily chooses to stay beside someone without commands, it means that person has earned complete trust. He looked around the room. Duke has never repeated that exercise with anyone until today. Director Pemberton slowly removed his glasses. So all these years, you never told anyone? Sydney shook her head. No. Why? She smiled thoughtfully. Because the military taught me something very important. Real service isn't about being recognized. It's about showing up when someone needs you. She looked around the emergency department. I wear different clothes now. She glanced down at her blue scrubs. But my mission never changed. The hallway remained silent. Several nurses quietly wiped away tears. One elderly Army veteran slowly stood from his wheelchair. His name badge identified him as Colonel Everett Landry, retired. He walked carefully toward Sydney. When he reached her, he stood at attention. Then, to everyone's surprise, he offered her a perfect military salute. The hallway froze. Sydney looked embarrassed. Sir, you don't have to. He smiled warmly. Oh, I know. He lowered his hand. I wanted to. His voice trembled. We spend so much time honoring uniforms. He looked at her scrubs. Sometimes we forget to honor the people still serving in different ones. Boo-hoo! No one in the hallway could hold back their emotions any longer. Director Pemberton quietly cleared his throat. Everyone. The crowd turned toward him. I think today Walter Reed learned something important. He looked at Sydney. We hired an outstanding trauma nurse. He smiled. What we didn't realize was that she had already spent years saving lives long before she walked through our doors. He extended his hand. Welcome home, Nurse Brant. Applause erupted throughout the hallway. Doctors applauded. Veterans applauded. Patients applauded. Hospital staff applauded. Even visitors who had no idea what had happened found themselves smiling through tears. Sydney accepted the applause with quiet humility. Then she looked down. Duke was still sitting perfectly beside her, just as he had years ago. Several weeks later, Walter Reed introduced a new volunteer program. Every month, retired military working dogs visited recovering veterans and young patients, not simply for therapy, but to remind everyone that healing often begins with trust. Director Pemberton asked Sydney to oversee the program. She accepted on one condition: no speeches. He laughed. Deal. I'd rather spend my time with the dogs. Months passed. The program quickly became one of the hospital's most cherished traditions. Veterans who rarely smiled began looking forward to Duke's visits. Children laughed as retired service dogs patiently accepted gentle hugs and belly rubs. Families found comfort in the calm presence of animals that had once served their country with unwavering loyalty. And every time Duke arrived, the routine was always the same. He would greet his handler, walk calmly through the hospital, pass every office, ignore every distraction, until he reached the nurses' station. Sydney would look up from her chart, smile, and quietly say, "Permission to come aboard, partner?" Duke's ears would perk. He would walk over, sit perfectly at attention. She would grin, at ease. Only then would he lean against her, closing his eyes with the complete trust of an old teammate who knew he was exactly where he belonged. One afternoon, Paige watched the familiar ritual with tears in her eyes. "I used to think he came here for his checkups." Sydney smiled as she scratched Duke gently behind the ears. "He does." Paige laughed. "I don't think that's the only reason." The handler, standing nearby, smiled knowingly. "No." He looked at Duke. "I think he comes back because every soldier deserves to visit the teammate who first taught them what trust feels like." Sydney rested her forehead lightly against Duke's. The busy hospital continued around them, but for a brief moment, the world seemed wonderfully quiet. Some heroes wear camouflage, some wear blue scrubs, and sometimes the only one who remembers both uniforms is a loyal military K9 who never forgets the person who believed in him before anyone else did.
Hi, I'm Gwyneth Wynne, the owner and manager of Beyond the Silence Tales. A military K9 ignored every command from his handler and walked straight to the new nurse. And what he did next revealed a secret she'd carried for 10 years. I'd really love to know what you think of this one. How did it make you feel? What stayed with me was the idea that trust doesn't disappear just because someone changes uniforms. It just waits quietly for the right moment to be recognized. Sydney never needed anyone to know who she used to be. She just kept showing up. Which moment got you the most? Have you ever met someone whose quiet kindness turned out to be hiding an incredible story of its own? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, feel free to like or subscribe for more from Beyond the Silence Tales.